Welcome to Business Better, a Ballard Spahr podcast designed to help businesses navigate the new normal. I'm Brendan Collins. I'm the leader of Ballard Spahr's Manufacturing and Consumer Products Industry Group and also a partner in the firm's Environment and Natural Resources Group. Today's podcast show is part of our Manufacturing Moment series, where we will discuss issues important to the manufacturing industry. We're kicking off our series with a discussion of manufacturers' priorities for the Trump administration. In today's episode, we'll start with a discussion of the priorities outlined in manufacturers' December 5, 2024 letter to the new administration and take a review as of late March 2025 on how the administration has been doing so far with these priorities and other issues important to manufacturers. Today, I'm joined by Charles Crain, the Managing Vice President of Policy for the National Association of Manufacturers. Charles, it's good to see you.
Thank you, Brendan. Glad to be here.
Charles, please introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us what you do there at the NAM.
So as you said, Brendan, my name is Charles Crain. I'm our Managing Vice President of Policy here at the NAM. The NAM is the National Trade Association for the manufacturing industry. We have about 14,000 corporate members. These are manufacturers, large and small, spread across the country in every state and every congressional district and in every subsector within manufacturing. Our job as advocates for the industry here in DC is to do exactly that, to support policies that are good for manufacturers and to oppose ones that are bad for manufacturers. And that means that we engage on a regular basis with the administration, with the federal agencies, and with Capitol Hill to ensure that manufacturers' voices are heard in all the policy debates of the day. And there are certainly plenty of those today and every day that impact manufacturers that we want to be sure our members are top of mind when policymakers are making these important decisions.
One of the things that caught our eyes in the private sector about what the NAM is focused on today comes from the regulatory space. You know, because you and I have talked about it in the past, that there were a lot of developments, a lot of legal developments in 2024, and a lot of hopes that the manufacturing industry has for the new Trump administration when it comes to regulatory reform. And on December 5th, 2024, there was a letter put together to the then President-elect Trump and his administration from a number of signatories in the manufacturing industry, including the National Association of Manufacturers. And that letter outlined a priority list of regulatory asks for the new administration, seeking executive action in areas ranging from environment and energy, labor and employment, corporate finance, intellectual property, and other areas. And so we wanted today to give you a chance to talk a little bit about that, as well as some other priorities that the NAM is working on. And we'd love to know, first of all, what was the impetus behind the letter and how did it come about in its final form?
So let me set the stage here for a minute. Manufacturers have been facing a regulatory onslaught for the past several years. We've conducted research here at the NAM that shows that the aggregate cost of federal regulations across the entire U.S. economy exceeds $3 trillion. That's trillion with a T, $3 trillion every year across the economy. Manufacturers face a disproportionate share of that aggregate $3 trillion burden. Manufacturers spend about $350 billion every year on compliance with federal regulations. These are dollars that are spent on regs, not on investing for the future, creating jobs, et cetera. And that can have a real impact on the industry's ability to grow and thrive here in the United States. That is especially true for small manufacturers. So the research that we commissioned shows that small manufacturers spend on average $50,000 per employee per year to comply with federal regulations. They don't benefit from the economies of scale that larger companies have. And so those regulatory costs have a real impact on their ability to compete here in the United States and to drive the manufacturing economy. And so we have been on the record for years now about the individual pieces of that regulatory onslaught that were particularly damaging for manufacturers. Regulations that exceeded agencies' statutory authority, that were particularly impractical for businesses to comply with, that are particularly costly, and what have you. And so we have quite a wide and deep body of work in terms of engagement with the agencies, engagement with Congress, and engagement in the federal court system of identifying regulations that aren't working, that are unbalanced, that are overreaching, that are impractical for manufacturers. And so when we sat down after the election, and I will say, we had planned to do this regardless of the outcome of the election, of really wanting to set a regulatory agenda for the incoming administration, irrespective of who the president-elect was going to be. But when we sat down after the election to think about what the Trump administration might be able to accomplish in the regulatory space, it generated quite a robust list of regulatory actions that they could take. And so the result is the letter that you referenced. It's signed by more than 100 manufacturing associations representing thousands and thousands of companies across the economy. And it identifies more than 36 regulatory actions that the new administration could take starting on day one to unleash manufacturing growth in the United States. So that's the impetus for the letter, and happy to talk about kind of the specifics of what's in it.
So the NAM convened this post-election review, and there were over 100 manufacturing organizations involved. How did that operate mechanically, and so that you made sure that the priorities of all these diverse organizations were reflected here in some way?
So it's a great question. So the NAM, along with our association partners, had launched a coalition on this exact topic a couple of years prior. So it's called the Manufacturers for Sensible Regulations Coalition. And specifically note the name of that coalition, where for sensible regulations, we're not for no regulations, right? We want balanced, workable rules. Manufacturers need rules of the road to comply with and to guide their long-term investments that manufacturers make. But we also need them to be workable and balanced and able to be complied with. So this coalition already existed. It was made up of many of the groups that ultimately signed the letter that we're discussing. And so that was kind of the locus point for this post-election conversation. We've all been on the record together for the past several years, identifying regulations that are not sensible, that are not workable for manufacturers. Which of those are prime candidates, whether because of substance or process, that the incoming Trump administration should be able to take a second look at and either rescind entirely or make modifications to make them more workable for manufacturers. And what we saw was tremendous interest in that project across the manufacturing economy. There are many, many, many manufacturing industry organizations. The NAM is the largest, and we represent the broadest subset of members. But many subsectors within manufacturing have their own individual trade association. And those trade associations were hearing the same thing from their members as we were from our members, which is that we really needed, as a country, to rethink the regulatory onslaught. And so there was quite a lot of interest in having a unified manufacturing voice to identify those specific issues for the Trump administration so they could get to work starting on day one.
With a degree of diversity among all these organizations and their individual constituencies that are reflected in this letter, was there a problem fitting everything in? Were there some key items that were dear to some that were left out without naming them? Was that all part of this process of developing the letter?
So our goal with this letter was to identify cross-cutting regulations that impact broad sectors of the manufacturing economy. So you'll see on the list, there's less in the way of super sector-specific regulations that might only impact some small segment of the manufacturing industry, but rather a focus on bigger, broader, deeper regulations. And so once viewed through that lens, there really was not a lot of conflict, frankly, among these association signers, because everyone agreed to focus on those high-level maximum impact regulations. And that led to the letter that you've seen, which reflects these really top-tier priorities that we really need the administration to focus on in the early days of the new administration.
Are there items on this list, cross-cutting as it is, that the NAM perceives as being the most urgent or the most important?
So I'm always hesitant to rank children above one another as a parent. I can say that there are certainly some that have a broader and deeper impact than others, which is not to say that you might want to ignore the ones that didn't qualify for that list. But I'll give an example. I think that's should be illustrative for the audience. So as a follow-on to this letter that we submitted, or maybe even as a reaction to, I would like to think, the EPA just released a couple of weeks ago its list of rules that it is going to be looking at from the past several years that might be in need of a second look, a refresh, potentially to be rescinded entirely. And if you look at the NAM statement in response to that announcement from the EPA, you will see the top tier regulations pulled out. So specifically, as an example, we highlighted that the EPA is reconsidering the Biden administration's PM 2.5 standard. I won't get into the super technical details, but essentially PM stands for particulate matter. These are particles in the air that are created by wildfires, by dust on the road, and by investing in a manufacturing facility. Shovels in the ground create dust in the air, right? And so the Biden administration had finalized a really unworkable standard in that space. We had been very vocal about the impact that would have on manufacturers' ability to invest in many areas of the country, which could have been forced into what's called non-attainment and not be able to have new investments in their areas. And so circling back to your question of what were the top tier priorities for us in this broader list, if manufacturers can't invest because the EPA standard says you can't have a single more iota of particulate matter in the air, that's a really existential threat for the industry. And so our response to the EPA working to reconsider that standard was quite effusive. And you can see our statement to that effect, really applauding the new administration for being able to focus on such a problematic rule from the previous administration. So that's just one example of a higher tier priority, a higher impact priority. But everything on this list is really critical to the manufacturing industry's ability to invest here in the United States.
So yes, EPA was, I would say, relatively quick to the podium with a list of specific rulemakings that it was going to revisit or reconsider. The letter outlines a number of other types of priorities, not within EPA's purview, obviously. Labor and employment, for example, being one, antitrust considerations, intellectual property regulations. Has there been movement from these other federal government agencies that have the reins on those other issues that is comparable to what you're seeing from EPA?
It's a great question. And certainly I would start the answer with a focus on the EPA. And I know you sort of took that as a given in the way you framed the question, but it really can't be understated the degree of alignment between what the EPA has put out as its items up for reconsideration and what the NAM and the manufacturing industry have laid out. So we certainly are glad to see that they are rowing in the same direction as we are on many of those top tier EPA-focused regulations. But I will say that the SEC actually beat the EPA to the punch in at least one area. They rescinded guidance very, very early on. It's actually under acting chair Ueda. Incoming Chairman Atkins has not yet been confirmed by the Senate. But this is a piece of guidance rather than rulemaking. So they could just rescind it with the acting chair's signature and working with the staff rather than having to do an entire rulemaking process. Under the previous SEC leadership under Chairman Gensler, the SEC had promulgated this guidance that essentially empowered activist investors to hijack public companies' proxy ballots for discussion of and voting on the kind of political issues of the day as a way to advance those activist political agendas. Some would say ESG agendas. I'm sure your audience is familiar with that terminology. But those things are, of course, often a distraction from the actual agenda of running a business, which is to say, creating shareholder value, investing for the future, creating jobs, et cetera. And so this guidance essentially required companies to include activist proposals on their proxy ballot, even if those proposals were completely divorced from the actual business of the company and were sort of purely political in nature. And so under acting chair Ueda, the SEC has rescinded that guidance. And so they actually got out ahead of this EPA reconsideration list. And so that's a long answer to illustrate that many departments and agencies within the government are already acting on manufacturers' priorities in the early days of the Trump administration.
In looking through some of the other priorities under intellectual property regulations, for example, the letter cites the issue of march-in rights. And I think we've heard some news on that as well lately. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a great example. Under the previous administration, the NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, had promulgated draft guidance that would essentially allow the government to seize manufacturers' intellectual property if the government decided that the product based on that intellectual property was priced unfairly in some way based on little to no actual standardization from the government. This is, of course, only if the product is developed in any part with federal research funding. So think about a biopharmaceutical product where at the very earliest stages had a few $100,000s of NIH funding. The private sector then invests hundreds of millions of dollars to turn this into an actual life-saving treatment. The idea that the government could then come in on the back end and seize your intellectual property would obviously be incredibly damaging to the innovation economy in the United States. And it was not limited to biopharmaceuticals. That's just sort of the best example. In the lead up to his confirmation hearings, Secretary Kennedy at HHS was asked about this specifically, and he said that march-in rights should not and cannot be used to impose price controls on innovators. So fortunately, that was just draft guidance. So we don't actually need the new administration to technically do anything. It would be nice if they sort of publicly refuted the idea of imposing march-in rights on innovative companies that are working to cure diseases and develop innovative products. But technically, they can just let that draft guidance die, which certainly would be something we would support because it would remove the threat of potentially undermining intellectual property in the United States. So just another example of areas in which the administration is moving in the right direction on regulatory policy.
Now, you've mentioned innovation and the goal of the NAM to help promote and preserve innovation wherever it can. One of the items mentioned in the letter was IRA energy implementation. And we've heard a fair amount recently, particularly in connection with budget back and forth in Congress, about the Inflation Reduction Act and its various incentive programs for clean energy, renewable energy, extension of tax credits for things like carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, nuclear. Has the administration revealed any directions there that either correspond to or go in a different direction from the NAM's letter?
So the IRA conversation is, of course, in the broader context of the tax conversation. And we can get into as much detail as you would like on tax. It's very much a top priority for the NAM. The top line, of course, is that the many key provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017 expire at the end of this year. In fact, several have already expired over the past several years. And so Congress, as you know, and as I'm sure your listeners know, is facing a very difficult math exercise to extend these pro-growth provisions from President Trump's first term using the budget reconciliation process because it is going to be a partisan exercise. So the Republicans who have majorities in both the House and the Senate cannot rely on Democratic votes to overcome a potential Senate filibuster. So they're using reconciliation, which comes with very strict scoring rules for Congress to follow that are incredibly mundane and boring for the average listener, but they're very exciting for DC types like myself. But the crux of it is that it's extremely expensive to extend many of the tax provisions, in addition to several of the additional policies that President Trump promised on the campaign trail. Think of his campaign pledges with regard to tax on Social Security, tax on overtime, tax on tips, and what have you. Those start running up the till when you're putting together a reconciliation package in the House and the Senate. Additionally, President Trump has been very clear that he's not the biggest fan of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was, of course, signed into law under President Biden. We have put quite a lot of effort into helping Republicans in Congress and the administration understand that many of the programs and policies in the Inflation Reduction Act are utilized by and are beneficial to manufacturers. Now, I will say the NAM opposed the Inflation Reduction Act. It had tax increases on manufacturers and it had price controls on biopharmaceutical manufacturers. So as an entire piece of legislation, it was not something we supported. And so we understand why President Trump was and is skeptical of the package. But it remains the case that there were still some good policies in it. So if we can show to Congress that those policies are supporting American investments in American jobs and American manufacturing, then that's worthwhile to extend and not use as a pay for the broader tax exercise that they're undertaking currently.
We've been talking mostly about regulatory implementation and administrative agency action. You mentioned the NAM's focus also as one of its main areas of interest on tax law. Can you expand a little bit about what the organization would like to see happen with respect to tax priorities of the new administration?
The NAM was a key champion of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This was a top priority of ours for literally decades. The tax code had not undergone full-scale reform since 1986. And so in 2017, manufacturers were absolutely on the field in working with Congress and President Trump during his first term to enact comprehensive pro-growth, pro-manufacturing tax reform. Baked into the statutory text of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act are the expirations that are now looming over our heads. Our CEO, Jay Timmons, was at the signing ceremony for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act at the White House. He has called TCJA rocket fuel for manufacturers, and we really saw that in the economy in 2018 and 2019 before COVID obviously changed the trajectory a little bit in 2020. But manufacturers saw record hiring, record wage increases, and record capital investments in 2018 and 2019 as a direct result of TCJA. And so what Jay said to us when he came back from the signing ceremony is that it's on us to show that manufacturers kept their promises. We said, if you give us tax reform, we will respond by hiring and giving wage increases and giving bonuses and investing in the future of the economy here in America. And so we, the NAM, as the representative of the industry here in DC, took it on ourselves to show that that all happened out in the real economy and to show that manufacturers kept their promises. And so we have been building towards this moment, literally since the moment that the law was signed by President Trump in the early days of 2018. And so we, as a top-line policy ask, want the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to be preserved in full. Now, that includes some of the provisions that started to drop off in 2022 and 2023 that are very much relevant to manufacturers specifically. So this is immediate expensing for your R&D costs, being able to expense those costs in year one rather than having to amortize them over a period of years. This is interest deductibility, and this is full and immediate 100% expensing for capital equipment purchases. Those all began to expire in 22 and 23. So the tax cliff, tax Armageddon, has already happened to our industry in 2022 and 2023. And then at the end of this year, 2025, there's even more coming down the pike. 90+% of manufacturers are organized as pass-throughs rather than as C corporations. And the pass-through deduction expires at the end of this year. So do the reductions in the individual rates and brackets, which are what pass-through manufacturers pay tax at, right? The changes to the estate tax, which are super relevant to family-owned manufacturers, expire at the end of this year. On the flip side, for our large multinational manufacturers, TCJA's changes to the international tax system all see changes coming down the pike at the end of this year. So it really is existential for the industry that Congress act with urgency to extend and preserve the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And so the NAM has been at the forefront of that fight to ensure that Congress knows what the manufacturing impacts are so they can get legislation over the finish line as soon as possible. Let me give you one stat and then I'll stop. I could talk tax all day. We commissioned a study that shows that if Congress fails to act on the pro-manufacturing tax policies within the TCJA, the American economy will lose 6 million jobs as a direct result of the expiration of pro-manufacturing tax policy. That is really a significant threat to the economy writ large and to manufacturing specifically. Across the economy, it'll have an impact of over $1 trillion in GDP lost if Congress fails to extend these provisions. And so the manufacturing industry is absolutely on the battle lines to preserve these critically important provisions that everybody championed back in 2017 and are now at risk in 2025.
As of the date of this recording, we're recording this on March 18th. There was just a continuing resolution squeaked through the Congress and avoided a government shutdown. How do you see the prospects for getting that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act 2.0 passed through this year?
So we at the NAM always say that we're about policy. We're not about politics. We're not about personality. And we're not about process. The funny thing about tax these days is it's a whole lot of process and not so much policy, right? Everybody knows what the policy is. They can go read the bill from 2017 if they want to. the news coverage is all about process. And we really try not to get bogged down in that. We know that the House and Senate have different starting point approaches. The House wants to do one big, beautiful bill, to quote the president, that includes both an extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act as well as, border and immigration priorities, energy priorities, defense priorities, and a kind of wide swath of stuff to get all of the administration's priorities in one big, beautiful bill. The Senate wants to break things up and take an easy win first. They think they can get a more narrow border defense and energy bill over the finish line quickly and get the administration a quick win, and then take a longer time to build out a tax package. We aren't taking sides between the House and the Senate. We had an event at the Capitol announcing our tax study, which showed that 6 million American jobs are on the line if Congress fails to act. And our keynote speakers were Jason Smith, the chair of Ways and Means, and Mike Crapo, the chair of Senate Finance. So we're not picking sides here. I should note also that Speaker Johnson attended that event. So we're really reaching here to be sure that everybody's involved. But we're not picking sides other than to say the degree of urgency is real for the industry. It is critically important that Congress get this over the finish line as soon as humanly possible. As you know, manufacturers plan years, decades in the future in terms of investment. And if you don't know what the tax law is going to be as you're planning those investments, it's really difficult to make decisions in the here and now about how you're going to spend your capital, where you're going to spend your capital. In 2017, that bill passed at whatever it was, midnight on New Year's Eve. I forget the exact day, but it was the absolute end of 2017. It was signed into law at the beginning of 2018. So all the pro-growth effects that came from TCJA were limited to 2018 and 19. We, of course, didn't know that there was going to be a pandemic in 2020, but you couldn't start getting the pro-growth effects in, August of 2017 or May of 2017. Republicans at the time focused on Affordable Care Act repeal in the beginning of 2017 and then did tax reform later. And so what we don't want to see this time around is delaying tax reform, because that delays manufacturers' ability to invest based on the pro-growth policies that will be included in tax reform. So we're not taking sides on process, but we really think they need to pick an answer on process so they can get the bill done, because that's what manufacturers need.
So we've talked about regulations and regulatory reform. We've talked about tax reform. The third big pillar of the NAM strategy to support manufacturing in the United States has to do with trade. And there's certainly been a lot of attention in the early days of this administration on the trade issue. How are we doing? What do you see as the direction of the administration, and how do you think the manufacturing industry will fare?
Well, I think saying that there's been attention on trade policy in the early days of the administration might be the understatement of the year. So I appreciate that as a setup. You're absolutely right that manufacturers are tracking closely the many and varied actions of the Trump administration on trade. We know that tariffs are a part of the president's agenda, and they are rightly a tool that he has in his toolbox to achieve pro-growth, pro-American, potentially pro-manufacturing policy outcomes. He has them as a tool that he can use to counter unfair trade practices that we in the past have identified. Countervailing duties, intellectual property theft, dumping. I mean, there's plenty of reasons where tariffs are an important part of a comprehensive trade strategy to go along with free trade agreements and working with our allies, things like USMCA. There's a lot that goes into a across-the-board trade agenda, and certainly tariffs can be part of that. So we know that there's going to be tariffs. The president campaigned on this, and we've certainly seen in the early days of his administration that he's making good on those promises. But what we also know is that there is going to be manufacturing impacts from any tariffs that are imposed. More than half, 56% of all imports into the United States are manufacturing inputs. So this is equipment and machinery. These are raw materials, critical minerals, et cetera, that manufacturers use to make things here in America. So we know the administration wants manufacturers to make things here in America. We want to make things here in America. And so when you think about the impacts of tariffs, you have to do that through the lens of the just absolute fact that more than half of anything that the U.S. imports is used by manufacturers to make things here. So we know there's going to be impacts from the president's tariff agenda. And so what we have said is that the administration should utilize trade and tariff policy as part of a comprehensive manufacturing strategy that has a degree of intentionality around it to support the growth of manufacturing here in the United States. There's going to be tariffs. We need tax reform to lower costs of manufacturers. There's going to be tariffs. We need permitting reform to help manufacturers get projects off the ground in a quick and low-cost manner so that we can start creating the jobs here in the United States that the administration wants to see and that the industry wants to see. There's going to be tariffs. We need to unlock American energy. Manufacturers are top users of energy, and we need low-cost and diverse sources of energy to invest in the United States. So there are lots of things that the administration can do to kind of blunt the impact of tariffs if they view it in the broader lens of a comprehensive, intentional pro-manufacturing strategy that cuts across all policy areas. Additionally, with respect to tariffs specifically, there are things that the administration can do that help minimize the manufacturing impacts. So you can scope out, for instance, key manufacturing inputs from the tariff conversation so that you aren't increasing cost on the inputs that we need to make things here in America. You can focus on free trade agreements. You can strengthen USMCA, President Trump's signature achievement from his first term. You can focus on zero for zero tariffs. So if a certain country isn't imposing tariffs on a certain subset of products from the United States, why would we impose tariffs back on them? Let's preserve zero for zero reciprocality to ensure that manufacturers can get the inputs that they need to make things here in America. So we have submitted these types of suggestions to USTR to help inform the administration as it develops its tariff agenda. We know that a key inflection point is coming in early April, when many of the reports that were mandated by the president's day one executive orders are then due back to the White House. He said in his address to Congress the other day that we should see on April the 2nd potential announcements of new tariffs. And so we're hopeful that the administration can keep in mind the manufacturing impacts of across the board tariffs and find ways to minimize what those impacts are by crafting tailored policy solutions that can address the concerns that the president has raised without harming manufacturers' ability to grow here in the U.S.
One of the benchmarks you mentioned there was the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which was essentially a reimagination of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And so I want to talk for a little bit about North American trade specifically. For the last 2 years, the NAM has co-sponsored with its counterparts in Canada and Mexico the North American Manufacturing Conference. I've had the privilege to attend those two terrific gatherings, and they've certainly impressed upon me the degree of interdependence among Canadian and U.S. and Mexican manufacturing businesses. They depend on each other for parts and assemblies, which certainly contributes to the statistic you used a few minutes ago about the percentage of imports that are manufacturing inputs. Can you focus the lens a little bit more narrowly on North American trade issues and share some insights on that?
So the USMCA is one of the president's signature achievements from his first term, and it is up for review in 2026. And I think you could probably fairly say it is currently under review, even though the official dates aren't until 2026. The NAM was a strong supporter of the USMCA for all the reasons that you just mentioned. North American trade is critical to manufacturers' ability to deliver products and to make things here in America. There are many examples of products that go across the border, either the northern border or the southern border, multiple times during their development as various parts are added and the product is changed and developed before it becomes a final packaged product that can be sold to consumers. And if you are imposing barriers to that cross-border flow, you're ultimately just adding costs to manufacturers in the U.S. And so the NAM really put a stake in the ground in supporting the USMCA, and we are certainly hopeful that the spirit of the USMCA maintains as the administration considers how to approach the review that's in 2026, and just in general, the U.S.'s trading relationship with our North American trading partners. Specifically, USMCA was hugely successful at moving trade volume from China to Canada and Mexico. And there's no reason that we would want to reverse that progress, right? We want trading relationships with our North American allies. And so the conference that you mentioned is a key part of the NAM's effort to ensure the robustness and visibility of those trading relationships. We hosted the inaugural version 2 years ago here at NAM headquarters in Washington, D.C. It was in Canada last year, and it'll be in Mexico this year. It's obviously on a rotating basis. And I think that really illustrates both the importance of North American trade and the importance of North American trade for manufacturing specifically, right? It's the North American Manufacturing Conference, not the North American Business Conference, right? With no disrespect to our business peers in other industries, manufacturing depends heavily on the ability to have free and reciprocal trade across the border with Canada and Mexico. And that's what USMCA did and was hugely successful from the president's first term. And so maintaining that type of treatment to allow the type of investment that we want to see here in America that results from those cross-border relationships is something that's critically important for us and I hope for the administration.
The administration did, I understand it, exempt from the originally announced Mexico and Canada tariffs goods covered under the USMCA. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct, yes. If you're USMCA compliant, at least under the current status quo, and I'm not sure when you're going to release this podcast, but at least as of March the 18th, yes, they are currently exempt from the Mexico and Canada tariffs.
Charles, thank you very much for these insights. And thank you, frankly, for all the work that the NAM is doing and its sister organizations are doing to support manufacturing in the United States. And I hope that we can perhaps have you back later in the year. We're going to be looking at different aspects of the regulatory reform and other administration policies affecting manufacturing. And I hope we can have you on again later in the year to share more insights. Again, everyone, our guest today is Charles Crain, Managing Vice President of Policy for the National Association of Manufacturers. And all I have left to say is thank you again, Charles.
Thank you for having me.
Make sure to visit our website, www.ballardspar.com, where you can find the latest news and guidance from our attorneys. Subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. If you have questions or suggestions for the show, please email podcast@ballardspar.com. Stay tuned for a new episode coming soon. Thank you for listening.